the age of discovery. But what was behind it? Unimaginable effort, hardship, personal sacrifice. Sometimes the scariest enemy on such voyages was the unknown. And often these journeys were marked by blood, violence, and death. One day, a Portuguese navigator embarked on such a voyage. His mission was to find a sea route to India. Little did he know that this journey would intertwine his entire life with that region in ways he could never have imagined. Did he expect what he would face? Probably, but one thing's for sure. With every expedition, his soul grew darker and heavier. This is a History Adventures, a story of a life devoted to duty. The year was 1503, February 12th. Out at sea, not far from the Indian city of Calicut, two hostile fleets stood facing each other. One fleet was Portuguese, consisting of about 20 ships. The other was a massive fleet of local Moors with over 100 ships gathered into one formidable armada. The situation was dire. The Portuguese were moments away from being boarded and annihilated. The enemy was closing in when suddenly the Portuguese admiral ordered his ships to turn broadside. He gave the signal, and the Europeans opened fire. Time froze. Enemy ships shattered, sank, and disappeared in clouds of smoke. Survivors were finished off with arrows. It was a breakthrough. Until then, ship cannons hadn't been used to destroy fleets. Battles were fought by boarding. But on that day, the Portuguese admiral of the Indian Ocean broke the rules of war and won what seemed to be an impossible battle. His name was Vasco da Gama. The second half of the 15th century. At that time, Rus was entrenched in battles against the Mongol Tatar yoke. The Byzantine Empire had just fallen, and on July 8, 1497, four of the largest warships of their time sailed out from the port of Lisbon. 170 seasoned sailors, their mission to find a sea route to India at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. The ships were stocked with gunpowder, weapons, and goods for trade, beads, honey, cloth, and other items crafted by European artisans. Vasco da Gama, sailing aboard the São Gabriel, was granted full authority to declare wars, make peace, and send envoys. The king endowed him with sweeping powers. The São Rafael was commanded by Vasco's brother Paulo. The Caravel Berrio was assigned to navigator Nicolau Coelho. They spent the remainder of the summer and autumn sailing along the African coast. Vasco da Gama pored over the records left by the earlier explorer Marco Polo, feeling deeply inspired by the adventure that lay ahead. As a child, growing up and forming his view of the world, it was rocked by news of the Ottoman conquests. He heard about the fall of Constantinople, one of the most important cities of the Christian world. These early experiences stayed with him throughout his life, deeply fueling his hatred of Muslims. Vasco da Gama had served in the Crusader forces in Morocco and had joined the Catholic military order of Santiago. After his time in Morocco, he was invited to the court of King John II. The king ordered him to take action against French pirates who had seized royal treasure ships off Portugal's coast. Vasco da Gama sailed along the Portuguese coast on a warship and destroyed every vessel flying a French flag. The king was pleased. So, when King John II decided to send an expedition to find a sea route to India, he didn't appoint Bartolomeo Diaz. Even though, back in 1488, Diaz had been the first European to reach the southernmost point of Africa and enter the Indian Ocean, still, the king passed him over in favor of a younger, bolder former crusader, Vasco da Gama. In early November, they entered a bay they named St. Helena. There, they rested and resupplied. They even became friendly with the local tribes. But then one Portuguese sailor somehow angered the locals and a scuffle broke out. The Europeans quickly realized their 2-week break was over and sailed off. On November 22nd, the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope and headed northeast. But not everyone took the St. Helena incident lightly. Some crew members panicked and shouted, "This is a disaster! We're all going to die!" That's when a plot formed. They wanted to arrest Vasco da Gama and sail back home, but he found out, boarded the mutineers' ship, and arrested the ringleaders, the navigator and the helmsman. Then he addressed the crew and said, "The only ones who could have helped you are now under my command, and the rest of the crew stands with me." Everyone got the message and apologized. By December, the expedition had reached the furthest point of Diaz's earlier route. Just imagine, everything beyond that point was uncharted. Then their supply ship broke down. They transferred all the cargo to the remaining 3 ships and burned the damaged one. That winter, they stayed put, repairing the vessels before the long journey ahead. In early March of 1498, they reached the city of Mozambique. The city was controlled by powerful Arab and Moorish merchants, ships carrying luxurious goods like silk, spices, gold, and enslaved Christians regularly docked there. The city was ruled by Emir Musa bin Bik, and something significant happened there that deeply influenced how the locals came to view the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama knew he needed a pilot to guide them toward India. That would make life much easier for everyone in the fleet. But hiring a Muslim for a Christian ship was nearly impossible. So the admiral came up with a clever plan. They disguised themselves as Muslim merchants heading to India. The Portuguese looked similar to Arabs, so it was believable. An elderly emir came out to meet them by boat. They exchanged gifts and pleasantries, and the emir promised them 2 pilots and supplies. Vasco da Gama knew this charade couldn't last forever, so he set off with a small group to collect the pilots. As soon as they approached the pilot settlement, a shot rang out from their ship, a signal of danger. They saw armed Moors in boats coming toward them. Their cover had been blown. The Portuguese grabbed the pilots, rushed back to their ship, and escaped. Well, escaped, meaning they drifted to a safe distance. But then the wind died. For 3 days they drifted along the coast, hoping to land and collect fresh water. In the chaos, they hadn't had the chance to do so. Meanwhile, the Moors launched attacks from the shore. In retaliation, the admiral set up a naval blockade. He seized every Muslim ship heading toward the port and began bombing Mozambique. Luckily, the wind returned soon after and they continued onward. Their second major stop was another Moorish city, Mombasa. Finally, a chance to refill their water supplies. They were welcomed warmly, but the pilots they had captured managed to escape and told everyone what had happened in Mozambique. Under torture, 2 local men confessed to the Portuguese that a plan was in place to capture them. That night, the ship was indeed attacked, but the Portuguese fought back and sailed on. However, 2 boats began chasing them. Vasco da Gama ordered the crew on one of them to be arrested. They suspected it carried pilots, and they were right. At least something had worked in their favor. On the horizon, the city of Malindi came into view. They hoped the people there hadn't yet heard about what had happened in Mombasa and Mozambique, but the local emir already knew. Fortunately, he despised the rulers of Mombasa, so he welcomed the Portuguese. They were finally able to restock supplies and get some much-needed rest. Vasco da Gama released the captured pilots and hired Indian ones instead. They were much more open to Christian Portuguese. The expedition then continued to India. About a month later, in late April, they reached their destination. This was it, India. Of course, after all their journey had put them through, these men and their ships hardly looked like representatives of a mighty naval power. Vasco da Gama gathered his captains and said, "Guys, we look like beggars. We've got 3 barely floating ships. So what now?" After a brief discussion, they decided to do what they always did, lie. In the end, they decided to tell everyone that their mighty Portuguese fleet was just around the corner and that they had gotten lost in a storm. Ahead of them was the city of Calicut. The ruler of Calicut was known as the Zamorin, Lord of the Sea. It was a major and thriving trading port, with Muslims holding significant influence at the court. The Portuguese, freshened up and dressed in their finest attire, made their way to meet the Zamorin. They left Vasco da Gama's brother behind to command the fleet, just in case the rest of them were killed. As they walked through the city, crowds gathered. Everyone was eager to see the Europeans. When they finally reached the Zamorin, Vasco began his speech, telling him that they came from a rich and powerful kingdom. He claimed that Portugal was filled with gold and that the king had sent him to establish a strong friendship and trade relations with India, or something like that. In the end, everything went pretty smoothly. The meeting lasted until after midnight. The next day, Vasco wanted to impress the Zamorin with gifts, so he gathered up all their valuables. According to custom, the presents were shown to the council, including feathered hats, bowls, a crate of sugar, and 2 barrels of olive oil and honey. The advisors laughed and asked, "Where's all that gold you claimed Portugal had?" In such a wealthy city, the barrels of oil and honey looked embarrassingly modest. Vasco da Gama was furious. He went back to see the Zamorin and tried to fix the situation. But the damage was done. Courtiers had already turned the Zamorin against him, calling Vasco a liar, a fraud, a pirate with no real goods to trade. So, when Vasco arrived at the palace, he was met by armed guards. They locked him up for 4 hours. But you know what? He still managed to negotiate. Eventually, they were granted permission to trade. Granted, they were imprisoned first. The Zamorin needed time to figure out who these men were, enemies or potential allies. Meanwhile, two opposing factions whispered in his ears. On one side were the Hindu merchants who supported the Portuguese. On the other side were the Muslims who despised them. To be fair, the Hindus didn't love the Portuguese either, but their hatred for the Muslims was stronger. Then, at the worst possible moment, a ship arrived from Africa. The crew described the Portuguese as pirates who bombed cities and bribed officials to execute the prisoners. But Calicut wasn't ready to go that far. Eventually, the Portuguese were released and allowed to trade, though with little to celebrate. Yes, it was their first official trading post, but under an economic boycott. People came into their shop, looked around at the goods, and left without buying anything. From time to time, Arabs would run up, wave their swords, and shout threats. Vasco da Gama was furious but held his ground. He ordered his men to buy local goods without haggling, and to behave respectfully. They could have just left India and gone home, but as you can probably imagine, Vasco wasn't the type to back down or give up easily. Rumors started to spread. They weren't just traders, they were actually spies. Then, Vasco da Gama heard that the locals had supposedly hired Egyptian pirates to kill them. He couldn't let that happen. Vasco da Gama sent a small delegation to the Zamorin to say farewell, as it was time for them to leave. But the Zamorin said, No, first you have to pay a huge tax. That night, their trading post was surrounded, and the envoys sent to the Zamorin were taken hostage. Vasco da Gama spent days thinking how to save them, until one day he saw a boat approaching the city. And he thought, aha, this is it. He looked, and there were 12 well-dressed young men. Vasco da Gama seized the boat, and it turned out that these were the sons of local nobles. He proposed a prisoner exchange. The Zamorin had no choice but to agree. But Vasco only returned 6 of them, saying he'd release the rest once his stolen goods were returned. The Zamorin handed over just a small portion of the cargo. So Vasco replied, got it. The rest stay with me. Ciao. And disappeared beyond the horizon. They set sail on September 30th, 1498. Finally, everyone made it out alive. Next stop, Portugal. But even reaching Africa was incredibly tough. Many sailors fell ill, and many died. They slowed down. They didn't have enough hands. Eventually, they had to make the difficult decision. Burn the São Rafael. Too few crew remained, and they moved everyone onto the other ships. Sadly, after a long illness, Vasco's brother, Paulo da Gama, passed away at a Franciscan monastery, and so, after a long and difficult journey, they returned to Lisbon. The people celebrated them. The king was pleased. And although he was greedy, very, very greedy, even he had to reward the heroes. Vasco da Gama was granted ownership of his hometown, Sines, but there was a catch. The town already belonged to the military order of Santiago, the same order Vasco was part of. The knights didn't want to give up the city, as it brought them income, so they demanded another city in exchange. However, the issue had to be settled through the Pope since the order answered to him. It became quite a messy situation. Technically, Vasco da Gama had been rewarded, but he couldn't truly enjoy his hard-earned reward. A victory without a trophy. The king even granted him a pension, but it came in irregular payments. The only positive thing? Soon he married Catarina, a woman from a wealthy family. As soon as what was left of Vasco da Gama's fleet returned to Portugal, the king began preparing a new expedition to Calicut. This time, Vasco and Bartolomeu Dias were merely advisors, with Admiral Pedro Álvares Cabral leading the mission. A fleet of 13 ships set sail on March 9th, 1500. And friends, it was a disaster. Cabral reached Calicut and even obtained trading rights from the Zamorin. But unlike Vasco da Gama, he had no patience for the locals' customs and had never heard of diplomatic finesse. The first minor conflict escalated into a bloodbath. The Portuguese fled to their ships, and their trading post was burned down. In retaliation, they shelled the city with cannon fire and sailed away empty-handed. They lost 7 ships. Only 6 made it back to Lisbon. The king realized things weren't going as planned, but he wasn't giving up. He decided to organize a new, more military-focused expedition. Initially, he still planned to entrust command to Cabral. Vasco da Gama was nearly driven mad with indignation. He begged to be made the commander, offering to give Cabral all his admiral's salary and even pay an extra 2,000 cruzados. For context, an ordinary sailor earned 5 cruzados a month. So why did he despise Cabral so much? First, Vasco believed Cabral would fail the mission again. Second, he sought revenge for the humiliation in Calicut. The king sided with Vasco and officially appointed him Admiral of the Indian Ocean. This time, Vasco da Gama wasn't assembling a trade fleet. He was building a war fleet. The time for diplomacy was over. He intended to conquer these lands. To secure future military successes, Vasco proposed keeping caravels patrolling the region year-round. They would protect trade routes and sink or loot any competition. The king said, "Excellent idea," and just like that, Vasco da Gama became a conqueror. This expedition wasn't made up of 4 ships, but 20, a serious force. But near the Cape of Good Hope, things went off track again. A storm struck, and they lost 1 ship. After enduring many hardships, the remaining ships finally reached Mozambique. The locals immediately recognized the returning sailors. Do you remember all the trouble before? Everyone braced for disaster. The emir quickly rushed out to greet them. "Take anything you want, no trouble here." Vasco da Gama was thrilled. He also sent one of his officers, with just 2 caravels, to seize a major trading port further up the coast. You know, the one Cabral had failed to conquer. The Portuguese made it clear, either you cooperate, or 20 more ships will show up and make things much worse for you. But the locals didn't wait to hear the rest. They agreed to cooperate immediately. The Portuguese set up a trading post and left a garrison behind, commanded by Fernando Magellan's cousin and best friend, the future explorer Francisco Serrão. So, Africa was taken care of. Time to head for India. This time, the ships reached the northern part of the Indian coast. Even better, thought Vasco da Gama. As they moved south, he decided to conquer everything in their path. Not that anyone was seriously resisting the Portuguese cannons. All who surrendered were forced to play by their rules. Again, King Manuel declared himself the Lord of all seas, and no one dared challenge that claim. He imposed 3 strict rules. First, no dealings with the Turks. That's a long story. And second, no independent trade in spices. The Portuguese wanted a monopoly. And third, no contact with Calicut. Anyone who broke these rules would see their hometown burned to the ground. They quickly proved their point. On their way to Calicut, they spotted a ship and seized it without resistance. It was filled with treasure, more than they had hoped for. But the most surprising part? The captain was the Zamorin's own advisor, the very man who had once suggested killing the Portuguese. Naturally, he immediately started begging Vasco da Gama for mercy, offering a ransom for himself and the crew, pleading for mercy. From Vasco da Gama. After stripping the ship of all its valuables, Vasco ordered it to be set on fire, with the entire crew still aboard. The Moors realized they had nothing left to lose and tried to fight back before the last Portuguese left their ship. To be fair, the Moors outnumbered the Portuguese, but they were practically unarmed, fighting with bare hands against armored sailors. The Portuguese slaughtered them by the dozens. So the Moors pushed the Portuguese to the sides of the ships. The Portuguese jumped into the water, trying to reach their own vessels. That's when Vasco da Gama blasted their ship to pieces with cannon fire, and those Moors who managed to swim and try to survive were finished off by the sailors with spears from the boats. But they still kept fighting. In short, it was an epic story. I'll let the eyewitness tell it. Let's hear from him. The Moors swam about, while our men gave chase in the boats, striking them down with spears. It so happened that one Moor, drifting in the water, came upon a spear. Raising himself above the surface as much as he could, he hurled it at a boat. The spear pierced through and slew a sailor. This seemed to me a most notable event, and I made record of it. Hundreds of people were sent to the bottom of the sea, and that was just the beginning of the terror. Calicut still lay ahead. On October 30th, 1502, Vasco da Gama's fleet reached the city. Of course, word of the Portuguese had already spread. The merchants, for example, hid their ships in river mouths to avoid detection. The Zamorin, just like Emir Musa bin Bik before him, sent Vasco da Gama a message: "Let's make peace, friendship, negotiation." Vasco responded with firm demands. He wanted full compensation for the goods lost in the previous expedition, all anti-Portuguese instigators handed over for trial, and finally, the complete expulsion of all Arabs and Moors. These were powerful and deeply rooted communities. Obviously, the Zamorin couldn't agree to that, so he refused. "Fine," said Vasco da Gama, and immediately took action. The medieval Portuguese historian Gaspar Correa described the events that followed like this. Then he ordered all ships to move closer to the shore and spent the entire day and night bombarding the city, causing heavy destruction. He only stopped firing because the recoil from the cannons had shaken the Portuguese ships' hulls dangerously loose. During the shelling, 2 large ships and 22 sambucs and boats entered the harbor filled with rice. When we spotted them, we chased them down using caravels. They couldn't escape. The rice made their boats too heavy. Out of the 22 sambucs, 6 belonged to traders aligned with the Portuguese, so they were spared. Then Vasco da Gama gave the order, loot the remaining 16 sambucs and the 2 large ships. Now I'll let Gaspar Correa continue. The captain-commander then gave an order. Cut off the hands, ears, and noses of all prisoners. Pile the body parts into a small boat. Place a priest in it, with his own severed hands, nose, and ears tied around his neck. Then he sent that boat with a letter to the Zamorin, suggesting he make curry out of what the priest had brought. In this way, he executed around 800 people, but even that wasn't enough. He went on to kill 30 more prisoners from Calicut. Their dismembered bodies were thrown into the sea so that the waves would carry them back to the shore. To each body he attached a note. One of them read, "Though these men were not guilty of killing any Portuguese, we've dealt with them this way simply because they were citizens of Calicut. The real traitors should expect even harsher revenge." So yes, he openly admitted to butchering innocent people. He kept the city under siege for 2 full days. Then he sailed a little south of Calicut to Cochin and other major trade cities nearby. And surprisingly, the local rulers welcomed him, even eagerly. They realized that with Portuguese support, they could finally settle scores with their rivals. So just imagine the kind of protection. It didn't take long before Portuguese trading posts were established in the area. But the situation was constantly shifting. While Vasco da Gama was in Cochin, the local Raja warned him that the Zamorin was still alive and planning revenge. He was raising a massive fleet with funding from Moorish merchants, all to drive the Portuguese out. Aha! So that's how it is? Thought Vasco da Gama, and decided to strike first. Right then, a messenger arrived with a letter from the Zamorin. It spoke of peace and friendship. Vasco figured the envoy was just a spy. He had the man arrested and tortured. The messenger cried, "Please, I'm just a courier. My whole crew has already been slaughtered." After hearing this, Vasco gave a chilling order. I don't think I've ever heard anything more brutal, and that's saying a lot given our past episodes like those on the Mayans or the Terracotta Army. Check them out if you haven't already. So they cut off the envoy's ears and nose and stitched on the ears and nose of a dog instead. Then they sent him back to the Zamorin with their best wishes. The Portuguese had a bold plan. They decided to strike first and set sail for Calicut. February 12, 1503, off the coast of the Indian city of Calicut, 2 fleets met in battle. The Moorish fleet, a formidable force of 100 ships, faced the Portuguese fleet, which consisted of only 20. I won't retell this story, since it's how our episode began. Just to remind you, instead of engaging in a boarding battle, the Portuguese used artillery and crushed the enemy fleet. Vasco da Gama defeated a force that massively outnumbered him. Afterward, he returned to Cochin, where he oversaw the construction of a fortress and trading posts. Then, he sailed back to Portugal. In September 1503, the fleet reached Lisbon. The second expedition was complete, marked by extreme brutality, even by the standards of the time. At times, that brutality bordered on cold, calculated sadism. There was an incident where Vasco da Gama sank a ship full of pilgrims returning from Mecca, including women and children. And it wasn't just about his hatred of Islam. No, he had spoken with Rajas and even the ruler of Malindi. The real reason was something else. Once, a group of prisoners were thought to be Indian Muslims. Vasco ordered them hung upside down from the rigging and executed with crossbows. But then it turned out, they weren't Muslims or Hindus at all. They were Christians, just like the Portuguese, Syrian Christians, in fact. It was a miracle they'd even been found. They had been known since the 10th century. Portuguese explorers had long searched the Indian coast to find them. It was actually one of the goals of the first expedition. Vasco da Gama refused to cancel the execution, but allowed a priest to give them last rites. The Portuguese terror was so extreme that the Sultan of Turkey threatened to destroy all Christian holy sites in Palestine and Syria unless it stopped. But the real motive wasn't religion. It was economic rivalry. Vasco da Gama was determined to wipe out Moorish shipping for good, seeing it as a direct threat to Portuguese trade dominance. His goal was clear: to eliminate any competition that could challenge the Portuguese crown's monopoly on the seas and ensure Portugal's economic supremacy. And the fact that Lisbon became the world's top trading port, much of that was thanks to Vasco da Gama. Still, the king was stingy with rewards. He didn't want to hand over the city he had once granted Vasco. The king acted like he had nothing to do with the legal disputes. But Vasco da Gama wasn't the type to wait around. He simply took the city by force. With veterans from his Indian campaigns, he moved in and began building a residence with his own money. He brought a ton of slaves, and construction began. Meanwhile, the city officially still belonged to the Order of Santiago. The local head of the order was intimidated by Vasco da Gama, and who could blame him? So he chose to ignore what was happening and stayed away from the part of town where Vasco resided. Even when Vasco began collecting taxes from the locals, the head of the order pretended to be ill and refused to leave his residence. Still, the order eventually decided to defend its legal rights to the city. The king sent a letter to Vasco da Gama, ordering him and his men to leave the city permanently. If he refused, he'd be fined 500 gold cruzados, face physical punishment, and other penalties for disobeying the crown. So Vasco left. Refusing would have meant open war with the very kingdom he had served so faithfully. Of course, the admiral held a grudge. He was banned from his own hometown. Yes, he built himself a grand palace elsewhere, but the bitterness and resentment stayed with him, lingering in his heart. The king tried to make peace, acting as if nothing had happened. He invited Vasco to meetings about new expeditions and sought his advice on colonial matters. But he never offered him any compensation or new titles, only empty promises. In short, he treated Vasco unfairly, and just then a conflict erupted at court. At a royal reception, King Manuel insulted an admiral. Drumroll, it was Ferdinand Magellan. He decided to renounce his Portuguese citizenship and offer his services to the Spanish crown. Many other respected captains who had long served Portugal followed him. One of them was Vasco da Gama. Naturally, the king didn't want to lose the famous admiral of the Indian Ocean, so he wrote Vasco a long letter full of flattery and praise. "Please don't leave, my friend. We'll work everything out." Along with the letter came a new title, Count of Vidigueira. The king had good reason to beg. Things in the Indian Ocean weren't going well. The same Zamorin, whom Vasco had fought before, was stirring again, this time raising a new army. He threatened the Raja of Cochin, "Either burn down the Portuguese fort or watch your city be completely destroyed in flames." The Raja refused, so the Zamorin, with an army of 50,000 men, stormed the city and took control. The Raja managed to escape and called for Portuguese assistance. A fleet led by Afonso de Albuquerque soon arrived at Cochin. Realizing he was about to be defeated again, the Zamorin quickly fled with his troops to avoid total destruction. The Raja returned and Portugal built a new fort. Albuquerque then turned his focus entirely to Calicut. The first attempt to capture the city failed, but the second succeeded. In Goa, Albuquerque built an impregnable Portuguese base in India. They captured the city and massacred its Muslim population. Goa became the capital of Portuguese holdings in the east. In 1511, he captured Malacca, and the chain of Portuguese strongholds in the Indian Ocean was complete. In 1514, they seized Hormuz, a critical strategic point at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. So, 15 years after Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, Portugal had established control over the Indian Ocean. However, after Albuquerque's death in 1515, everything started to decline. And you might wonder, why? Corruption, along with shady officials who embezzled tax money and made secret deals with the Moors behind the king's back, had taken a toll. Some even sold weapons to enemy states, such as the Sultan of Aden. Something had to be done to restore order and stability. But who could be trusted to take charge? That's when they remembered the old admiral, Vasco da Gama. He was eager to return to action. 14 warships left the harbor in Lisbon. By the way, in 1507, he had finally had a total falling out with the Order of Santiago over the city dispute. After that, he joined the Order of Christ. This order had been established from the Portuguese branch of the Templars after the Catholic Church and the French crown wiped out the Templars across Europe. We covered that in our episode on the Crusades. It was under the banner of the Order of Christ, essentially the Templars' cross, that Vasco da Gama embarked on his third voyage. September 1524. Vasco da Gama arrived in Goa, the capital of Portuguese India. Now holding the title of Viceroy of India, he immediately set to work. It was as if he had become young again. From the very start, Vasco da Gama shocked the local elites. He refused their gifts, a gesture that meant, "Let's work together." With these actions, he made it clear. His answer? Probably not. He ordered a full investigation into corruption and required all reports to come directly to him. Soon, he uncovered that one wealthy man had been stealing from others and committing fraud. Vasco announced that anyone this man had robbed could reclaim their property. The rich man was ruined. And that's how Vasco dealt with every corrupt elite. He stripped them of power, seized their money, and more. He ordered an audit of the military stockpiles. If anything was missing, the responsible officers were dismissed and punished. Because missing weapons meant someone was selling Portuguese arms. He personally approved all new appointments after extremely long interviews. Every noble-born kid dreaming of high office had to go through brutal selection, and usually public humiliation. He yelled, mocked, threw papers around, but his age and the fact that he barely slept and worked constantly started to take a toll on his health. Vasco da Gama was suffering from malaria but kept working. After wrapping things up in Goa, he traveled to Cochin. Painful ulcers opened up on his neck and scalp. He became so weak he had to be carried around in a chair. Still, he continued working, convinced that everything would fall apart without him. But the illness finally took its toll. Despite his determination, Vasco da Gama passed away on December 24th, 1524, in Cochin. When we talk about the history of Portugal and the Age of Discovery, Vasco da Gama's enduring legacy is impossible to overstate. Not only did he find the sea route to India, he also introduced a new style of naval combat. Not with boarding parties, but with cannons. You know, when you study history, it's always fascinating to try to understand what drove people to justify their actions. Actions that led to horrifying massacres and the killing of innocent people. Not in war, just because. Of course, some would say it was a brutal time. That's just how the world worked back then. Maybe the moral compass of European society back then was simply different. Even the Catholic Church didn't oppose such things. It's important to reflect on how these contradictions existed within people's souls. What do you think? Was Vasco da Gama a pirate or a great explorer who shaped history? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories from the Age of Discovery, leave a comment too. This has been History Adventures. I'm Alina Sopova. See you later. For centuries, pirates ruled the seas. They plundered ships full of treasure, sometimes even capturing the budgets of entire kingdoms. Yet, in storms, they often lost their hard-earned loot as quickly as they acquired it. The treasures were swallowed by the ocean, lying deep at the bottom. And that's exactly what we'll be searching for in our next episode.